Okay, here we are to the last section of notes for the school year. I know you wish it could be done now, but we still have one more section to do. And so what we're going to talk about today are selectors in CSS. So if you haven't done so already, what you need to do is open up a window in your on your computer where you can watch the video and follow along, type the notes as I include them, and then you're going to submit the notes to me on Google Classroom when finished. So what we're going to talk about in this section has to do with using selectors in CSS. And selector is a term that you already know. When we do a command in CSS, you know that the part that goes outside the brackets on the left-hand side is the selector, and that's the part that's being formatted. There are different types of selectors. We've only worked with one so far. So we're going to start off by reviewing that particular one. So the one that you've been using all along is what we call a type selector. And sometimes it's referred to as being a tag selector. Sometimes it's called an element selector. So whether it's tag, type, or element, it's all the same thing. That just refers to a command that's going to format an HTML command. So it has the same name as the HTML command. The only thing that doesn't have is the less than symbol and the greater than symbol that we put around for the brackets in an HTML command. So we're used to using these. They can be good. At the same time, they can also be a bad thing depending on what you're trying to accomplish. The advantage to using this type of selector is that it applies to all parts of the HTML document that use that tag. So, for example, yesterday you had an assignment to do, and in that assignment you had to format the first letter of each paragraph, where you made it red, Century Gothic font, a large size. There were several paragraphs in that assignment, but you only used one single command and it affected all of those because it affected anywhere where there was a P tag. So that's a good thing. You can kill a lot of birds with the same stone, so to speak. However, sometimes it could be a bad thing. And the disadvantage is exactly the same as the advantage. The disadvantage is that it applies to all tags. So the problem becomes that if you make this command, it's like a blanket command. It's going to affect everything that's the same tag. Well, what if, like in yesterday's assignment, what if I only wanted you to make first letter of a paragraph big in a different color in a different font, but I only wanted it to be one paragraph, not all paragraphs? If you're doing a type selector, it's not going to work that way. So that's where it can be pretty limiting. Okay, but like I said, this is the one that you do have some familiarity with. Now we're going to talk about ones that you don't know. So the next one that we're going to talk about is called a universal selector. And a universal selector is one that I like to use a lot when I'm creating a page. What it's going to do is whatever commands that I have in my declaration block, it's going to apply to all elements on the page. The way that we do this is where the selector would go on the left-hand side outside the curly brackets. We're going to put an asterisk in. Oops. We're just going to put an asterisk, and then inside the curly brackets, the formatting that we want to use. I'm going to give you an example right now. So let's take a look at the example here. This is what it would look like. My declaration block looks exactly like it would for what we've been doing all along, but now for my selector I just have an asterisk. So this means that no matter what goes on the page, whether it's an H1 tag, an H2 tag, a picture, a bulleted list, a table, the background color will be blue. The text color will be white. And the way that I explain this to the morning class is that it's kind of like if you've ever watched Bob Ross, the artist, if you've ever watched one of his painting videos. He always starts out at the beginning, before he creates his masterpiece, he takes, usually titanium white, but he takes a particular color and he kind of paints it all across the canvas as a background before he builds the background and the pictures on top of it. And by using the universal selector, kind of does the same thing. So what I do when I create web pages is a lot of times at the beginning of my CSS commands, I'll use a universal selector. I'll set my background color and my text color. Later on in my CSS commands, maybe I have a part of the screen that I want to have as another color. I can do that as long as the universal selector command comes first and the other ones come later. Then you can do that. And I'll show you some examples in a little bit. But that's the universal selector. So there's another one that I want you to know about. It's called a group selector. And a group selector, I know I said earlier about killing multiple birds with one stone. This does exactly that. Well, not literally kill birds with a stone. But what it does is it applies formatting to multiple elements. So instead of having separate commands in CSS, you can actually have one command in CSS and have it apply to more than one part of the screen. And the way that we do this is we just separate our selectors by commas. So if I want to have 3 different things with the same commands, I just put one and a comma and another one and a comma and the third one, and that's going to appear on the outside of the curly brackets. And what you can do with this is you can actually combine different types of selectors. Now again, before today, the only one you knew was the type selector. Now you know the universal selector, and in a couple of minutes you're going to learn some more. But you can actually have more than one type, as long as they're separated by commas. So I'm going to give you an example of what this one looks like. Let's say that in my web page I have an H1 tag and an H2 tag, and I want them to have the same formatting. So what I would do is I would put them in my selector like this, separated by commas, and then whatever is in the brackets is going to apply to both of those. So in my case, if this was a real command, it would change my font to Comic Sans and it would change my text color to yellow for both the H1 and the H2 commands. And that's what a group selector is like. And I'll show you some examples of these in just a few minutes. Okay, so we have a couple more to talk about. The next one is a little more complicated. But it's definitely something that if you want to have a good looking and nice dynamic web page, you want to use. It's called a class selector. And the purpose of a class selector is that it's used to apply formatting to a few elements on a page. And it's good for defining areas of a page to format. So I might have a web page and I want to have a certain kind of background color that shows up near the top of the page. But it doesn't necessarily apply to just like a tag, an HTML like tag selector. It applies to an area. So a class selector is a good way to kind of divide it up. My second hour Computers 2 class did some pretty cool CSS animations this year, and I think I may have shown them to you in class. If you did see those, understand that those wouldn't have been possible without my students using a class selector to be able to define those parts of the page. It has a couple of different parts to it. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to actually make up a class name. So we're going to give a class a name, and we're going to apply that class only to the tags that you want to format in a particular way. So when we create our class name, there are some rules to it. And the first rule is that the class name in CSS has to have a decimal point at the beginning. And another thing is that the class name after the dot, the decimal point, the first letter or the first character has to be a letter. So you can't start a class name with a number. You can use numbers in a class name, they just can't start with one. Another thing to keep in mind, you can't have any spaces, and you can't have any special characters in the name. So if you're trying to represent a space, you'll have to use an underscore. You can't use things like hashtags or asterisks inside of a class name either. And another thing to keep in mind about class names is that they are case sensitive. So if I make a class selector and it's called blah, B-L-A-H, and it's all lowercase, and I try using it in a command with capital letters instead, it's not going to take. So they are case sensitive. And I'm going to give you an example of one that you could see. So let's say that I have a top part of the page and I want to call it my heading. So I create this class name, dot heading. You can see the dot at the front. You can see that it starts with a letter. And then whatever goes inside the brackets will apply to that area that I have to find. So in this case, whatever this heading area is on the page is going to make my text color pink, and it's going to make my font size 3Ms. That is only part of how we do this though, because it's fine to use this in your CSS, but you also have to tell the browser where this area is on the page. So the other part is, besides the CSS command, is where you're going to put this into your HTML code. And that's where we have something called a div tag. Div just stands for division, and it's used to identify a logical division on a page. Example of what this would look like: div, and then a space, class equals, and then in quotation marks, whatever that class name is. So the div tag's not used by itself in this case. We have to add the class attribute to it. So we would put that in front of whatever HTML commands we want to be a part of that area of the page. Oops, I just did that wrong. And then the last thing that we would do is we would put a closing div tag after it. So you're telling the browser where that part of the page starts, you're telling that browser where that part of the page ends. And hopefully it'll make more sense to you when I show you some examples here in a little bit. But I do have one more type of selector for you to put into your notes, and that is what we call an ID selector. And this one is very similar to the class selector. It's used to identify a unique part of a page. And it's used a lot of times to try to isolate part of an HTML element. So for example, let's say I have an H1 tag and it says today is Wednesday. and I want the word Wednesday to be formatted differently from the rest of that H1 tag, I would use an ID selector for that. Another thing that it's used for, which doesn't apply to us this year, but sometimes it's used for some JavaScript, which is what the 5th hour Computers 2 class is using, and is also used sometimes for some long web pages. So there are other uses for it besides the way that we're going to deal with it. And one thing to keep in mind about an ID selector, it is the most powerful selector that exists in CSS. What I mean by that is no matter what other CSS commands might be inside a style sheet, this particular one will override any of those commands. So maybe I have a universal selector and I changed my background color to purple. And then I have a tag selector for the H1 tag, and it's going to change my background color to blue. But then I have an ID selector, and it's going to change the background color to yellow. It doesn't matter that there were these previous commands. This one is going to take precedence over it. So the way I explained it to the morning class, it'd be like in your household, there's someone who kind of has the rule in the house. The example that I gave was, let's say that Sam decides she's going to go into town and do something. So we're at home. She says to Caroline, Caroline, I'm going to go to Dairy Queen and get some ice cream. And Caroline's like, whatever, Sam, I don't care. And then Sam walks by my room and she says, Mom, I'm going to go to Dairy Queen and get some ice cream. And I say, okay, Sam. And then she gets out to the driveway and she runs into my husband, who sometimes is pretty strict. And he said, what are you doing, Sam? And she says, well, I'm going to Dairy Queen to get some ice cream. And he's like, no, you're not. And it doesn't matter that I said it was okay or that Caroline said it was all right. He's the one that overrides everyone else when it comes to permissions like that. That's the example that really relates to how the ID selector works. Okay, so it's like a class selector. It's going to have two parts, just like we did with that. So first thing is that then the name of an ID selector has to start with a hashtag. So instead of a dot, like a class selector, it's going to have a hashtag. So example would be like hashtag blue, background color blue. So if I'm trying to just take this like small isolated part of the page and set my background color to blue, no matter what any other command may have said, I would identify it with this ID selector, hashtag blue. Like the class selector though, you also have to tell the browser in your HTML code where this would be located. So we have a couple of options here. We can use the div tag like we did for the class selector, but instead we would do div ID equals, and then you would put in the name. So in my case, I'm doing blue just to match my other example. Notice that when I use my div tag, I don't put the hashtag in the name. And I should point out that that was true up above with a class selector. Class selector name has a dot in front of it, but when you're referring to it in a div tag, you don't put that dot in front of it. So you would use that div tag, and then wherever that formatting ends or should end, you would put in a closing div tag. There is another option. The other option is, instead of a div tag, we use a tag called span. We still do ID equals and then the name and then a closing span tag. So that's the other way that you can do it. And then just a couple little notes about this, or one little note. The span tag is like a div tag, but it's used for smaller areas, and it doesn't create a physical division on the page. If I use a div tag, it's going to put a break up above the item. It's going to put a break below the item. It will actually insert a physical division. If I use the span tag, it's not going to do that. So what I'm going to do right now is pull up an HTML file that I made, a little sample one, and I'm going to show you how some of these commands work. So if you take a look on my screen, here's my notepad file. And I'll make it a little bit bigger just in case it's difficult to see. Ooh, if my computer doesn't freeze. There we go. Okay, all right. So my HTML, I have an H1 tag, an H2 tag, and an H3 tag. I have a little bit of bold text, which I think I'll put in a P tag here. And then I have a bulleted list. So if I open this up in my browser right now, selectors. Okay, if I open up in my browser right now with no CSS to it, this is what it looks like. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to back up. And you can see I have a style tag and a closing style tag. So in between are where this is where I'm going to put my CSS commands. First thing I'm going to show you is how to do the universal selector. So the universal selector, like I said, this is the one that's going to apply to every part of the page. And we do it by just putting in asterisks. Asterisk, I can't talk. So let's say that I want my background color to be blue and I want my text color to be white. Now when I reload my page, see how that took effect? I didn't have to do separate commands for H1, H2, for my H3, my bold text, my bulleted list. It just did it all at once. Now if I want to, let's say that where I have my H1 tag, Mrs. Rivera's class, and where I have my H2 tag, Computers 1, let's say that I want those to be a particular color. So I'm going to go H1, comma H2, and I am going to set my color to yellow. Okay, so when I'm doing this is what we call a group selector. It saves time so that you're not typing separate commands. It's going to apply the same formatting. And while I'm at it, I might as well change my font. And I'm going to set it to Papyrus. So now when I reload my page, it still did the universal formatting, but then because this command was after it, it goes on top of it. Just like Bob Ross paints his happy little trees on top of his titanium white background. Okay, now let's say that I want to, let's see, which one should I use next? Let me show you how the class selector works. So let's say that I want this whole area of the page, Mrs. Rivera's class, Computers 1, 5th hour, and Mrs. Rivera's favorite foods. Let's say that that area of the screen I want to apply a class selector to. And I am going to go back to my HTML and my CSS commands here, and I'm going to create a div tag. So my div is going to be up above my heading. So I'll go div class equals, and I'm just going to name it top. I don't have a dot in front of it. And I want it to go just below Mrs. Rivera's favorite foods. So I'll put my closing div tag there. So that means that when I do my class selector, it's going to apply to everything that I have highlighted. So up above in my CSS command, now I'm going to format this. So I'm going to go dot top, because remember a class selector name has to start with a decimal point. And then I'm going to apply formatting. So let's say that I want all of this text to be centered. So I'll do text align center. And the background color, let's say that I want this to be pink. No, let me do light pink. I think light pink's a color. So now I'm going to try to save this and see if it takes effect. And it does, kind of. I definitely have it centered like I want it to be. You'll notice the pink background, but it's not covering everything. So that one's a little bit tricky. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and I'm going to take my background color away from it because I don't want to get too complicated right now. So there. Okay. And so I created my own class of area of the page to format. And then I'm going to show you an ID selector. So let's say that in Mrs. Rivera's class that I want Rivera's to be different. So what I'm going to do is use a span tag. So down in my HTML, I'm going to do span ID equals, I'm just going to call it name, and I'm going to put a closing span tag after the part that I want to format because I only want it to affect this one word. So up above, I'm going to do hashtag name because an ID selector name always has that in front of it. And I'm going to change the font to Copperplate Gothic Bold. I think that's how it's named in the system. And I'm going to take the font size and I'm going to set it to 100 pixels. And I'm going to make the color, let's see, I will go with green. And if I did this correctly, it is only going to apply to the word Rivera. So let me reload it. And there it is. I'm looking at the wrong one though. I thought I was doing Mrs. Rivera's class, and apparently I did Mrs. Rivera's favorite food. So I just put it in a different spot. But you can totally see how it did that formatting. Now, what I said the difference between a div tag and a span tag is that a div tag will put a physical break in between it. So I might as well use this as my example. You'll notice Mrs. Rivera's favorite foods. It didn't break it at all. Now, if I go back to my page and instead of in my HTML, instead of using a span tag, I do div. And I reload the page. What I'm going to see here is not what I really want, but this is just to show you what ends up happening. Notice how it took Rivera's and it put it in its own separate line because a div tag puts a little gap up above and a little gap below. Sometimes that might be what you're looking for. In my case of my example, the previous one is really the one that I wanted to use. So what I'd like you to do is save your notes. You're going to submit them to me on Google Classroom so that I know that you finished this, and we'll talk about this some more over the next few days.